All right. Hello, 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 and welcome back to Story Time Saturdays. I'm your narrator for this morning, Fraggeth. And today we're going to continue our reading through Astounding Stories of Super-Science from October of 1930. And up next is the titular story, or the cover story, from this issue, which was The Invisible Death by Victor Rousseau. This is again from October of 1930, Astounding Stories of Super-Science. And that means the story could have been written earlier than then, but call that a good frame of reference for time period. So this is pre-World War II, pre-World War II science fiction. Um, and there's invisible stuff in it. Which of course was around, gosh, when did H.G. Wells write The Invisible Man? I think that was Wells, wasn't it? Let me find out. The Invisible Man. Yes, H.G. Wells. 1897 for The Invisible Man. I may read that sometime aloud because that one's fun too, as well as some Jules Verne. I've been kind of jonesing for some Jules Verne. 20,000 Leagues, Journey to the Center of the Earth, a couple others. Master of the World, I think, was another one. That one was cute too. Okay. And without much further ado, I do have a bit of a head cold, so pardon me if I sound a little sniffly. There's some massive weather front that is just crushing me at the moment. And not just me. All right. Take another sip here and get started. Or, that can happen. Okay. So something's going on. Give me a moment. Oh, I know what it is. I see. I've got it. I've got it. I've got it. I know what it's doing. This streaming technology is it's special. Where are you? Output. Recordings. Browse. Apparently I can't do it while streaming. Okay. Well, so that's not going to work either. All right. This isn't going to be quite what I wanted, but we'll make do. without any further ado, we'll just ignore those issues and move on. How does that sound? Sounds spectacular. There's also this one's fairly long too, so I'm gonna be hard pressed to uh, keep my voices straight because there's a lot of them. This is gonna be like the entire 2 hour stretch really. Oh, or I can close the program like a goof. Let's try that again. Let's give that a whirl. Okay, this'll have to do. The Invisible Death, a complete novelette by Victor Rousseau. Chapter 1, Out of the Hangman's Hands. "You speak," said Von Kettler, jeering, "as if you really believed that you had the power of life and death over me." The superintendent of the penitentiary frowned, yet there was something of perplexity in the look he gave the prisoner.
Von Kettler, I think it is time that you dropped this absurd pose of yours, he said, in view of the fact that you are scheduled to die by hanging at 8 o'clock tomorrow night. Your life and death are in your own hands.
Von Kettler bowed ironically. Standing in the superintendent's presence in the uniform of the condemned cell, collarless, bareheaded, he yet seemed to dominate the other by a certain poise, breeding, nonchalance. "Your life is offered." Whoops.
Your life is offered you in consideration of your making a complete written confession of the whole ramifications of the plot against the federal government,
the superintendent continued.
"Rather a confession of weakness, my dear superintendent,"
jeered the prisoner.
Oh, don't worry about that. The government has unraveled a good deal of the conspiracy. It knows that you and your international associates are planning to strike at civilized government throughout the world in the effort to restore the days of autocracy. It knows you are planning a world federation of states based on the principles of absolutism and aristocracy. It is aware of the immense financial resources behind the movement. Also, that you have obtained the use of certain scientific discoveries which you believe will aid you in your schemes.
"I was wondering," jeered the prisoner, "how soon you were coming to that."
They didn't help you in your murderous scheme, the superintendent thundered. You were found in the War Office by the night watchman rifling a safe of valuable documents. You shot him with a pistol equipped with a silencer. You shot down 2 more who, hearing his cries, rushed to his aid. And you attempted to stroll out of the building, apparently under the belief that you possessed mysterious power which would afford you security.
"A little lapse of judgment, such as may happen with the best laid plans," smiled Von Kettler. "No, Superintendent, I'll be franker with you than that. My capture was designed. It was decided to give the government an object lesson in our power. It was resolved that I should permit myself to be captured, in order to demonstrate that you cannot hang me, that I have merely to open the door of my cell, the gates of this penitentiary, and walk out to freedom."
Have you quite finished?
Rasped the superintendent.
"At your disposal,"
smiled the other.
Here's your last chance, Von Kettler. Your persistence in this absurd claim has actually shaken the expressed conviction of some of the medical examiners that you are sane. If you make that complete written confession that the government asks of you, I pledge you that you shall be declared insane tonight and sent to a sanitarium from which you will be permitted to escape as soon as this affair has blown over.
"The United States government has sunk pretty low to involve itself in a deal of this character, don't you think, my dear superintendent?"
jeered Von Kettler.
The government is prepared to act as it thinks best in the interests of humanity. It knows that the death of one wretched murderer such as yourself is not worth the lives of thousands of innocent men.
And there, smiled Von Kettler, without abating an atom of his nonchalance, there, my dear superintendent, you hit the nail on the head. Only instead of thousands, you might have said millions. Von Kettler's aspect changed. Suddenly his eyes blazed, his voice shook with excitement, his face was the face of a fanatic, of a prophet. Yes, millions, Superintendent, he thundered. It is a holy cause that inspires us. We know that it is our sacred mission to save the world from the drabness of modern democracy. The people, always the people. Bah! What are the lives of these swarming millions worth when compared with a Caesar, a Napoleon, an Alexander, a Charlemagne? Nothing can stop us or defeat us, and you with your confession of defeat, your petty bargaining, I laugh at you.
You'll laugh on the gallows tomorrow night,
The superintendent shouted. Again Von Kettler was the calm, superior, arrogant prisoner of before. I shall never stand on the gallows trap, my dear superintendent, as I have told you many times, he replied. And since we have reached what diplomacy calls a deadlock, permit me to return to my cell. The superintendent pressed a button on his desk. The guards, who had been waiting outside the office, entered hastily.
Take this man back,
He commanded, and Von Kettler, head held high and smiling, left the room between them. The superintendent pressed another button, and his assistant entered, a rugged, red-haired man of 40, Anstruther, familiarly known as Bull Anstruther, the man who had in 3 weeks reduced the penitentiary from a place of undisciplined chaos to a model of law and order. Anstruther knew nothing of the superintendent's offer to Von Kettler, but he knew that the latter had powerful friends outside.
Anstruther, I'm worried about Von Kettler, said the superintendent. He actually laughed at me when I spoke of the possibility of another medical examination. He seemed confident that he could not be hanged. Swore that he will never stand on the gallows trap. How about your precautions for tomorrow night?
We've taken all possible precautions, answered Anstruther. Special armed guards have been posted at every entrance to the building. Detectives are patrolling all streets leading up to it. Every car that passes is being scrutinized, its plate numbers taken and forwarded to the motor bureau. There's no chance of even an attempt at rescue. Literally none.
He's insane,
Said the superintendent, with conviction, and the words filled him with new confidence. It had been less Von Kettler's statements than the man's cool confidence and arrogant superiority that had made him doubt.
but he's not too insane to have known what he was doing. He'll hang.
He certainly will, replied Anstruther. He's just a big bluff, sir.
Have him searched rigorously again tomorrow morning, and his cell, too. Every inch of it, Anstruther. And don't relax an iota of your precautions. I'll be glad when it's all over.
He proceeded to hold a long-distance conversation with Washington over a special wire. In his cell, Von Kettler could be seen reading a book. It was Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra, that compendium of aristocratic insolence that once took the world by storm until the author's mentality was revealed by his commitment to a madhouse. Von Kettler read till midnight, closely observed by the guard at the trap, then laid the word aside with a yawn, lay down on his cot, and appeared to fall instantly asleep. Dawn broke. Von Kettler rose, breakfasted, smoked the perfecto that came with his ham and eggs, resumed his book. At 10 o'clock Bull Anstruther came with a guard and stripped him to the skin, examining every inch of his prison garments.
The bedding followed. The cell was gone over microscopically. Von Kettler, permitted to dress again, smiled ironically. That smile stirred Anstruther's gall. "We know you're just a big bluff, Von Kettler," snarled the big man. "Don't think you've got us going. We're just taking the usual precautions, that's all." "So unnecessary," smiled Von Kettler. "Tonight I shall dine at the Ambassador Grill. Watch for me there. I'll leave a memento." Anstruther went out, choking. Early in the afternoon, two guards came for Von Kettler. "Your sister's come to say good-bye to you," he was told, and he was taken to the visitors' cell. This was a large and fairly comfortable cell in a corridor leading off the death house, designed to impress visitors with the belief that it was the condemned man's permanent abode, and, by a sort of convention, it was understood that prisoners were not to disabuse their visitors' minds of the idea. The convention had been honorably kept. The visitor's approach was checked by a grill, with a 2 yard space between it and the bars of the cell. Within this space a guard was seated. It was his duty to see that nothing passed. As soon as Von Kettler had been temporarily established in his new quarters, a pretty, fair-haired young woman came along the corridor, conducted by the superintendent himself. She walked with dignity, her bearing was proud, she smiled at her brother through the grill, and there was no trace of weeping about her eyes. She bowed with pretty formality, and Von Kettler saluted her with an airy wave of the hand. Then they began to speak, and the German guard who had been selected for the purpose of interpreting to the superintendent afterward was baffled. It was not German. Neither was it French, Italian, or any of the Romance languages. As a matter of fact, it was Hungarian. Not until the half hour was up did they lapse into English, and all the while they might have conversing on art, literature, or sport. There was no hint of tragedy in this last meeting. "Goodbye, Rudy," smiled his sister. "I'll see you soon." "Tonight or tomorrow," replied Von Kettler indifferently. The girl blew him a kiss. She seemed to detach it from her mouth and extend it through the grill with a graceful gesture of the hand, and Von Kettler caught it with a romantic wave of the fingers and strained it to his heart. But it was only one of those queer foreign ways. Nothing was passed. The alert guard, sitting under the electric light, was sure of that. They searched Von Kettler again after he was back in the death house. The other cells were empty. In 3 of them detectives were placed. In the yard beyond, the hangman was experimenting with the trap. He himself was under close observation. Nothing was being left to chance. At 7 o'clock, 2 men collided in the death house entrance. One was a guard, carrying Von Kettler's last meal on a tray. He had demanded Perigord truffles and pâté de foie gras, cold lobster, endive salad, and near beer, and he had got them. The other was the chaplain, in a state of visible agitation. "If he was an atheist and mocked at me, it wouldn't be so bad," the good man declared. "I've had plenty of that kind. But he says he's not going to be hanged. He's mad, mad as a March hare. The government has no right to send an insane man to the gallows."
"All bluff, my dear Mr. Wright," answered the superintendent when the chaplain voiced his protest. "He thinks he can get away with it. The commission has pronounced him sane, and he must pay the penalty of his crime."
By that mysterious process of telegraphy that exists in all penal institutions, Von Kettler's boast that he would beat the hangman had become the common information of the inmates. Bets were being laid, and the odds against Von Kettler ranged from 10 to 15 to 1. It was generally agreed, however, that Von Kettler would die game to the last.
"You all ready, Mr. Squires?"
The prowling superintendent asked the hangman.
"Everything's okay, sir."
The superintendent glanced at the group of newspaper men gathered about the gallows. They, too, had heard of the prisoner's boast. One of them asked him a question. He silenced him with an angry look.
"The prisoner is in his cell and will be let out in 10 minutes. You shall see for yourselves how much truth there is in this absurdity, he said.
He looked at his watch. It lacked 5 minutes of 8. The preparations for an execution had been reduced to almost to a formula. 1 minute in the cell, 20 seconds to the trap, 40 seconds for the hangman to complete his arrangements. 2 minutes, and then the thud of the false floor. 4 minutes of 8. The little group had fallen silent. The hangman furtively took a drink from his hip pocket flask. 3 minutes. The superintendent walked back to the door of the death house and nodded to the guard.
Bring him out quick, he said.
The guard shot the bolt of Von Kettler's cell. The superintendent saw him enter, heard a loud exclamation, and hurried to his side. One glance told him that the prisoner had made good his boast. Von Kettler's cell was empty. Chapter 2. Conference. Captain Richard Rennell, of the U.S. Air Service, but temporarily detached to intelligence, thought that Fredegonde Valmy had never looked so lovely as when he helped her out of the cockpit. Her dark hair fell in disorder over her flushed cheeks, and her eyes were sparkling with pleasure. "A thousand thanks, Monsieur Rennell," she said, in her low voice with its slight foreign intonation. "Never have I enjoyed a ride more than today. And I shall see you at Mrs. Wansley's ball tonight?" "I hope so, if I'm not wanted at headquarters," answered Dick, looking at the girl in undisguised admiration. "Ah, that headquarters of yours! It claims so much of your time," she pouted. "But these are times when the intelligence service demands much of its men, is it not so?" "Who told you I was attached to intelligence?" demanded Dick bluntly. She laughed mockingly. "Do you think that is not known all over Washington?" she asked. "It is strange that intelligence should act like the ostrich who buries his head in the sand and thinks that no one sees him because it is hidden." Dick looked at the girl in perplexity. During the past month he had completely lost his head and heart over her, and he was trying to view her with the dispassionate judgment that his position demanded. As the niece of the Slovakian ambassador, Mademoiselle Valmy had the entry to Washington society. The ambassador was away on leave, and she had appeared during his absence, but she had been accepted unquestionably at the embassy, where she had taken up her quarters, explaining, as the ambassador confirmed by cable, that she had sailed under a misconception as to the date of his leave. Brunette, beautiful, charming, she had a score of hearts to play with, and yet Dick flattered himself that he stood first. Perhaps the others did too. "Of course," the girl went on, "with the Invisible Emperor threatening organized society, you gentlemen find yourselves extremely busy. Well, let us hope that you will locate him and bring him to book." "Sometimes," said Dick slowly, "I almost think that you know something about the Invisible Emperor." Again she laughed merrily. "Now, if you had said that my sympathies were with the Invisible Emperor, I might have been surprised into an acknowledgment," she answered. "After all, he does stand for that aristocracy that has disappeared from the modern world, does he not? For refinement of manners, for beauty of life, for all those things men used to prize." "Likewise for the existence of the vast body of the nation in ignorance and poverty, in filth and squalor," answered Dick. "No, my sympathies are with law and order and democracy, and your invisible emperor and his crowd are simply a gang of thieves and hold-up men." "Be careful!" A warning fire burned in the girl's eyes. "At least it is known that the Emperor's ears are long." "So are a jackass's," retorted Dick. He was sorry next moment, for the girl received his answer in icy silence. In his car, which conveyed them from the tarmac to the embassy, she received all his overtures in the same silence. A frigid little bow was her farewell to him, while Dick, struggling between resentment and humiliation, sat dumb and wretched at the wheel. Yet the idea that Fredegonde Valmy had any knowledge of the conspiracy or its leaders never entered Dick's head. He was only miserable that he had offended her, and he would have done anything to have straightened out the trouble. It seemed impossible that in the year 1940 the peace of the civilized world could be threatened by an international conspiracy bent on restoring absolutism, and yet each day showed more clearly the immense ramifications of the plot. Each day, too, brought home to the investigating governments more clearly the fact that the things that they had discovered were few in number in comparison with those they had not. The headquarters of the conspirators had never been discovered, and it was suspected that the powerful mind behind them was intentionally leading the investigators along false trails. The conspiracy was worldwide. It had been behind the revolution that had recreated an absolute monarchy in Spain. It had plunged Italy into civil war. It had thrown England into the convulsions of a succession of general strikes, using the communist movement as a cloak for its activities. But nobody dreamed that America could become a fertile field for its insidious propaganda. Yet it was behind the millions of adherents to the so-called Free Men's Party, clamoring for the destruction of the Constitution. Upon the anarchy that would follow, the absolutist regime was to be erected. Already the mysterious powers had struck. Departments of state had been entered and important papers abstracted. The Germania had mysteriously disappeared in mid-Atlantic, and a shipping panic had ensued. There were tales of mysterious figures materializing out of nothingness. It was known that the conspirators were in possession of certain chemical and electrical devices with which they hoped to achieve their ends. The superintendent of the penitentiary had had in his pocket an authorization to stop the execution of von Kettler after he stood on the trap. Dead, he would be a mere mark of vengeance. Alive, he might be persuaded to furnish some clue to the headquarters of the miscreants. And behind the conspirators loomed the unknown figure that signed itself the Invisible Emperor. In the communications that poured in to the White House and to the rulers of other nations, in the threats that were materializing with stunning swiftness. Who was he? Rumor said that a former European ruler had not died as was supposed, that a coffin weighted with lead had been buried, and that he himself, in his old age, had gone forth to a mad scheme of world conquest with a body of his nobles. It had been practically a state of war since the shipment of gold, guarded by a detachment of police, had been stolen in broad daylight outside Baltimore, the police clubbed and killed by invisible assailants, as they claimed. The press was under censorship, troops under arms, and it was reported that the fleet was mobilizing. In the midst of it all, Washington shopped, danced, feasted, flirted, like a swarm of mayflies over a treacherous stream. Intelligence was alert. As Dick started to drive away from the Slovakian embassy, a man stepped quickly to the side of the car and thrust an envelope into his hand. Dick opened it quickly. He was wanted by Colonel Stopford at once, not at the camouflaged headquarters at the War Department, but at the real headquarters where no papers were kept, but weighty decisions were made. And to that devious course the government had already been driven. Dick parked his car in a side street, it would have been under espionage in any of the official parking places, and set off at a smart walk toward his destination. Nobody would have guessed, from the appearance of the streets, that a national calamity was impending. The shopping crowds were swarming along the sidewalks, cars tailed each other through the streets. Only a detachment of soldiers on the White House lawn lent a touch of the martial to the scene. The building which Dick entered was an ordinary 10-story one in the business section. The various legal firms and commercial concerns that occupied it would have been greatly surprised to have known the identity of the Ira T. Graves, importer, whose name appeared in modest letters upon the opaque glass door on the 7th story. Inside, a flapper stenographer, actually one of the most trusted members of the intelligence's staff, asked Dick's name, which she knew perfectly well. Not a smile or a flicker of an eyelid betrayed the fact. "Mr. Rennell," said Dick with equal gravity. The girl passed into an inner room, and a buzzer sounded. In a few moments the girl came back.
Mr. Graves will be here in a few minutes, Mr. Rennell, if you'll kindly wait in his office, she said.
Dick thanked her, and walked through into the empty office. He waited there till the girl had closed the door behind him, then went out by another door and found himself again in the corridor. Opposite him was a door with the words Entrance 769 and a hand pointing down the corridor to where the intelligence service had established another perfectly innocent front. Dick tapped lightly at this door, and a key turned in the lock. The man who stepped quickly back was one of the heads of the civil service. The man at the flat-topped desk was Colonel Stopford. The man on a chair beside him was one of the heads of the police force. The colonel, a big, elderly man dressed in a gray sack suit, checked Dick's commencing salutation. Oh my gosh, I can't read today. The colonel, a big, elderly man dressed in a gray sack suit, checked Dick's commencing salutation. "Never mind etiquette, Rennell," he said. "Sit down. You've heard about the man Von Kettler's escape last night, of course." "Yes, sir." "It's known, then. We can't keep things dark. He vanished from his cell in the death house 3 minutes before the time appointed for his execution, though, as a matter of fact, he wasn't going to be hanged. Apparently, he walked through the walls. There's a sequel to it, Rennell. It seems he had told the assistant superintendent, a man named Anstruther, that he'd meet him at a restaurant in town that night. He promised to leave him a memento. Anstruther happened to remember this boast of Von Kettler's, and he surrounded the restaurant with armed detectives on the chance that the fellow would show up. Rennell, Von Kettler was there." "He went to this restaurant, sir?" "He walked in just before the place was surrounded, engaged a table, and ordered a sumptuous meal. He told the waiter his name, said he expected a friend to join him, walked into the washroom, and vanished. 2 minutes later, Anstruther and his men were on the job. Von Kettler never came out of the washroom, so far as anybody knows." In the midst of the hue and cry, somebody pointed to the table that Von Kettler had engaged. There was a $20 bill upon it, and a scrap of paper reading, "I've kept my word, Von K." Colonel Stopford looked at Dick fixedly. "Rennell, we may be fools," he said, "but we realize what we're up against. It's a big thing, and we're going to need all our fighting grit to overcome it. You're one of the 4 men we're depending on. We're counting on you because of your record and because of your degree in science at Heidelberg. The President wishes you to take charge of the whole Eastern Intelligence District, covering the entire southeastern seaboard of the United States. You are to have complete freedom of action, and all civil, military, and naval officials have received instructions to cooperate with you." "There goes Mrs. Wanley's ball," thought Dick, but he said nothing. "We're not the hunters, Dick Rennell," went on Colonel Stopford. "We're hiding under cover, and I'm counting on you to turn the tables. They even know my office is here. I had a long-distance call from Savannah this morning in mocking vein. They advised me to have the White House watched tonight. I warned the President, and we've posted guards all around it." "They held the wire while you called up the President?" asked Dick. "Damn it, no! They called me up from Scranton the instant he'd finished speaking. They have the power of the devil, Rennell, with all that infernal invisibility invention of theirs." Let's try that again. "They have the power of the devil, Rennell, with that infernal invisibility invention of theirs. Rennell, we're fighting unknown forces. Who this invisible emperor is, we don't even know. But one thing we've found out. He has his headquarters somewhere in your district. Somewhere along the South Atlantic seaboard. The greater part of his activities emanate from there. But we're fighting in the dark. The clue, the master clue that will enable us to locate him, that is what we lack." The sun had set. It was beginning to grow dark. Colonel Stopford switched on the electric lamp beside his desk. "What have you to say, Rennell?" he asked. and Dick was aware that the two other men were regarding him attentively. "It's evident," said Dick, "that Von Kettler possessed this means of invisibility in his cell and wasn't detected. He simply slipped out when the guard came to fetch him. Invisibility? Yes, but invisible's not the same thing as transparent," cried Stopford. "These folks have operated in broad daylight. They're transparent, damn them. Not even a shadow. You know what I mean, Rennell? What I'm thinking of? That crazy man you were in touch with 6 months ago who prophesied this. We turned him down. He showed me a watch and said the salvation of the world was inside the case. I thought him insane." "You mean Luke Evans, sir. That watch was his pocket model. He went off in a huff, saying the time would come when we'd want him and not be able to find him." "But, damn him, he wanted to produce universal darkness or some such nonsense, Rennell, and I told him that we wanted light, not darkness." It It wasn't exactly that, sir. Colonel Stopford was a man of the old school. He had been an artillery officer in the Great War, and was characteristically impatient of new notions. Dick began carefully. "You'll remember, sir, old Evans claimed to have been the inventor of that shadow-breaking device that was stolen from him and sold in England." "To a moving picture company!" snorted Stopford. "I asked him what moving pictures had to do with war." Evans was convinced that the invention would be applied to war. He claimed that it made the modern methods of military camouflage out of date completely. He said that by destroying shadows one could produce invisibility, since visibility consists in the refraction of wavelengths by material objects. When they stole his invention, he foresaw that it would be used in war. He set to work to nullify his own invention. He told me that he had unintentionally given to the enemies of the United States a means of bringing us to our knees, since he believed that British Motion Picture Company was actually a subsidiary of Krupp's. He worked out a method of counteracting it. You must get him, Rennell. Even if it's all nonsense, we can't afford to let any chance go. If Evans's invention will counteract this damned invisibility business." The telephone on the colonel's desk rang. He picked it up, and his face assumed an expression of incredulity. He looked about him like a man bewildered. He beckoned to the police official, who hurried to his side and thrust the receiver into his hand. The official listened. "All right," he said. He turned to Dick and the civil service representative. "Gentlemen," he said, "the President has disappeared from his office in the White House, and there are grave fears that he has been kidnapped." Chapter 3. In the White House. Colonel Stopford's car had been parked around the corner of the building, and within a minute the four men were inside it, Stopford at the wheel, and racing in the direction of the White House. A nod to the guard at the gate, and they were inside the grounds. At the entrance, a single guard, in place of the four who should have been posted there, challenged sharply, and attempted to bar the way, not recognizing Dick or Stopford in their civilian clothes. "Where's your officer?" demanded Stopford shortly. Half cowed by the colonel's manner, the young recruit hesitated, and the four swept him out of the way and hurried on. The scene outside the main entrance to the White House was one of indescribable confusion. Soldiers were swarming in confused groups, some trying to force an entrance, others pouring out. Every moment civilians, streaming over the lawn, added to the number. Discipline seemed almost abandoned. From inside the building came outbursts of screams and cursing, the scuffling of a mob. "Roscoe! Roscoe!" shouted Stopford. "Where's the President's secretary? Who's seen him? Let us pass immediately." No one paid the least attention to him, but a short, bare-headed civilian who was struggling in the crowd heard and shouted an answer, waved his arms, and began to force his way toward the four. It was Roscoe, the secretary of President Hargreaves. The president was a childless widower, and Roscoe lived in the White House with him and was intimately in his confidence. Roscoe gained Stopford's side. "Say, they've got him!" he panted. "They've got him somewhere inside the building. They're trying to get him out. We've got to save him, but we can't see them or him. They made him invisible too, curse 'em. I heard them crying, 'Help me, Roscoe!' He saw me, I tell you, and I didn't know where he was." The little secretary was almost incoherent with fear and anger. The 5 men, forming a wedge, hurled themselves forward. Out of the White House entrance appeared a tall officer, revolver in hand. It was Colonel Simpson of the President's staff. Half beside himself, he swept the weapon menacingly about him, shouting incoherently, and clearing a passage, into which the 5 hurled themselves. Stopford seized his revolver hand, and after a brief struggle Simpson recognized him. "He's in the building!" he shouted wildly. "Somewhere upstairs! I'm trying to form a cordon, but this damned mob's in the way! Kick those civilians out!" he cried to the soldiers. "Shoot them if they don't go! Guard the windows!" Stopford and Dick, at the head of the wedge, pushed it past into the White House. The interior was packed. Men were struggling frantically on the staircase. It seemed hopeless to try to do anything. Suddenly, renewed yells sounded from above, a scream of anguish, howls of terror. There came a downward surge, then a forward and upward one, which carried the 2 men up the stairs and into the president's private apartments above. In the large reception room, a mob was struggling at a window, beneath a blaze of electric light. A soldier was standing there like a statue, his face fixed with a leer of horror. In his hands was a rifle, with a blood-stained bayonet, dripping upon the hardwood floor at the edge of the rug. Upon the rug itself a stream of blood was spouting out of the air. Dick looked at the sight and choked. There was something appalling in the sight. It was the quintessence of horror, that widening pool of blood, staining the rug, and flowing from an invisible body that writhed and twisted, while moans of anguish came from unseen lips. Colonel Stopford leaped back, livid and staring. "God, it's got eyes! 2 eyes!" he shouted. Dick saw them too. The eyes, which alone were visible, were about 6 inches from the floor, and they were appearing and disappearing as they opened and shut alternately. It was a man lying there, a dying man, pierced by the soldier's bayonet by pure accident, dying and yet invisible. The mob had scattered with shrieks of terror, but a few bolder spirits remained in a thin circle about that fearful thing on the rug. Dick bent over the man and felt the outlines of the writhing body. It was a man, apparently dressed in some sort of uniform, but this was covered from the top of the head to the feet with a sort of sheer silken garment, bifurcating below the waist and resembling a cocoon. It seemed to appear and alternately to vanish. Dick seized the filmy cuff in his fingers, rent it, and stripped it away. Yells of terror and amazement broke from the throats of all. Instantly, the thin circle of spectators had become reinforced by a struggling mass of men. The half-visible cocoon clung to Dick's body like spider webs, but the man who had been wearing it had sprung instantly into view beneath the cluster of electric lights. He was a fair-haired young fellow of about 30 years, his features white and set in the agony of death. He was dressed in a trim uniform of black with silver braid, and on his shoulders were the insignia of a lieutenant. He opened his eyes, blue as the skies, and stared about him. He seemed to understand what had happened to him. "Dogs!" he muttered. Shrieks of fury answered him. The mob surged forward as if to grind his face to pieces under their feet, and then recoiled, mouthing and gibbering. But it was at Dick that they were looking, not at the dying man. He raised himself upon one elbow with a mighty effort. "His Majesty the Invisible Emperor! Long be his reign triumphant!" he chanted. It was his last credo. The words broke from his lips, accompanied by a torrent of red foam. His head dropped back, his body slipped down. He was gone. And no one seemed to observe his passing. They were all screaming and gibbering at Dick. "Rennell! Rennell!" yelled Stopford. "Where are you, Rennell? God, man, what's happened to your legs?" Dick looked down at himself. For a moment he had the illusion that he was a head and a trunk floating in the air. His lower limbs had become invisible, except for patches of trousering that seemed to drift through space. The mob in the room had fallen back, gaping at him in horror. Then Dick understood. It was the invisible garment that had coiled itself about him. He tore it from him and became visibly a man once more. Shouts from another room. A surging movement of the crowd toward it. The muffled sounds of an automatic pistol, fitted with a silencer. Then screams. "The devils are in there! They're murdering the soldiers!" There followed a panic-stricken rush, more muffled firing, and then the sharp roar of rifles, and the fall of plaster. Someone was bawling the president's name. The rooms became a mass of milling human beings, lost to all self-control. A bedlam of noise and struggle. Men fought with one another blindly. Cursing soldiers fired promiscuously among the mob, riddling the walls, stabbing at the air. The plaster was falling in great chunks everywhere, filling the rooms with a heavy white cloud in which all choked and struggled. The yells of the civilian mob below, struggling helplessly in the packed crowd that wedged the great stairway, made babel. Outside the White House, a dense mob that filled the lawns was yelling back and struggling to gain admittance. Suddenly, the lights went out. "They've cut the wires!" rose a wild, wailing voice. "The devils have cut the wires! Kill them! Kill everybody!" His cry ended in a gurgle. Somewhere in that dark hell a struggle was going on, a well-defined struggle, different from the random, aimless battling of the half-crazed soldiers and the civilians. President Hargreaves was still within the walls of the White House. It was known. It was physically impossible for him to have been carried away when every foot of space was packed. And through that darkness the invisible assailants were edging him, foot by foot, toward the outside. Dick was on the edge of this silent battle. He sensed it. Bracing himself against a bureau while the mob surged past him, he tried to pierce the gloom, to reinforce with his perceptions what his instinct had told him. A soldier, crazed with fear, came leaping at him, bayonet leveled. He thrust with a grunt. Dick avoided the glancing steel by a hand's breadth, and, as the impetus of the man's attack carried him forward, caught him beneath the chin with a stiff right-hand jolt that sent him sprawling. From below, the cries broke out again, with renewed violence. "They've got the president! Get them! Get them! Close all doors and windows!" But a door went crashing down somewhere to the tune of savage yells. The mob was pouring down the stairs. It was growing less packed above. Dick heard Stopford's voice calling his name. "Here, sir!" he shouted back, and the two men collided. "For God's sake, do what you can, Rennell!" shouted the colonel. "They've got the president downstairs. They had him in this very room, in the thick of it all. I heard him cry out, as if under a gag. They put one of those damned cloths over him. God, Rennell, I'm going crazy!" The upper floor of the White House was almost empty now. Dick thrust himself into the crowd that still jammed the stairs. He reached the ground floor. It was lighter here, but a glance showed him that it was impossible to attempt to restore any semblance of order. The big east room was jammed with a fighting, cursing throng. Dick stumbled over the bodies of those who had fallen in the press or had been shot down. Outside, the mob was thickening, swarming through the grounds and screeching like madmen. Nothing that could be done. Dick found himself caught once more in the human torrent. Presently he was wedged up against a broken window. He precipitated himself through the frame, dropped to the ground, stopped for an instant to catch breath. The yelling mob was congregated about the main entrance of the White House, and on this side the grounds were comparatively empty. As Dick stopped, trying desperately to form some plan of action, he heard footsteps and low voices near him. Then two men came toward him, followed by three or four others. The men, but though the light was faint, Dick realized instantly that they were wearing invisible garments. He could see nothing of them. He could see through where they seemed to be, the trees, the buildings of the streets. Yet they were at his elbow, and they saw him. He heard one of them leap, and sprang aside as the butt of a pistol descended through the air and dropped where his head had been. Yet no hand had seemed to hold it. It had been a pistol, reversed and flashing downward, to be arrested in midair 6 inches from his face. But the men were not wholly invisible. Nearly 6 feet above the ground, 3 or 4 pairs of eyes were staring malevolently into Dick's. Only the eyes were there. The two foremost men were breathing heavily. They were carrying something. Grotesquely through a rent in the invisible garment, Dick saw a patch of trouser. He heard a muffled sigh. President Hargreaves in the hands of his abductors! Dick's actions were reflex. As the pistol hung beside his face, he snatched at it, wrested it away, struck with it, and heard a curse and felt the yielding impact of bone and flesh. He had missed the head, but struck the shoulder. Next moment, hands gripped the weapon, and a desperate struggle began. It was torn from Dick's grasp. He struck out at random, and his fist collided with the chin of a substantial flesh and blood human being. Invisible arms grasped him. He fought free. The pistol slashed his face sideways, the sight ripping a strip of flesh from the cheek. He was surrounded, and he was being beaten down, though he was fighting gamely.
Kill the swine! Shoot! Shoot!
Dick heard one of his assailants muttering. Out of the void appeared the blue muzzle of another automatic, with a silencer on it. Dick ducked as a flame spurted from it. He felt the bullet stir his hair. He grasped at the hand that held it, and missed. Then he was held fast, and the muzzle swung implacably toward his head again. Helpless, he watched it describe that arc of death. It was only later that he wondered why he had fought all the while in silence instead of crying for help. But of a sudden the pistol was dashed aside. A woman's voice spoke peremptorily, in some language Dick did not understand, and he saw her eyes among the eyes that glared at him. Dark eyes that he knew, even if the voice had not revealed her identity. The eyes and voice of Fredegonde Valmy. Dick cried her name. He put forth all his strength into a final struggle. Suddenly he felt a stunning impact on the back of his head. He slipped, reeled, threw out his hands, and sank down unconscious on the grass at the side of the path. Chapter 4: The Invisible Ambassador. Fredegonde Valmy implicated in the conspiracy. That was the first thought that flashed into Dick's mind as he recovered consciousness. He might have suspected it. But the idea that the girl he loved was bound up with the murderous gang that was attacking the very foundations of civilization chilled him to the soul. Dick had been picked up a few minutes after he had been struck down, excuse me, identified by Colonel Stopford as he was about to be removed to a hospital and carried into the White House. Order had been restored by the arrival of a detachment of troops from Fort Myers, the severed cables located and mended, and by midnight the interior of the presidential home had been made habitable again. President Hargraves was gone, kidnapped despite the utmost efforts to protect him, and it was impossible to conceal that fact from the world. But the wheels of government still revolved. All night an emergency council sat in the White House, and, deciding that in a time of such grave danger, heroic means must be adopted, with the consent of such of the congressional leaders as could be summoned, a council of defense was organized. The whole country east of the Mississippi was placed under martial law. The fleet and army were put on a war footing. Flights of airplanes were assembled at numerous points along the eastern seaboard. To this council Donald was attached as a head of intelligence for the Eastern Division. Yet all this availed little unless the location of the Invisible Empire could be ascertained, and, despite telegraphic reports that came in hourly, alleging to have discovered its headquarters, nothing had been achieved in this direction. The garment taken from the slain soldier had been examined by a half dozen of the leading chemists of the East. Pending the arrival from New York of the celebrated Professor Hausmeyer, it was deposited under military guard in a dark closet. The result was unfortunate. The garment exhibited to the assembled scientists was a mere bifurcated silken bag. The gas with which it had been impregnated, though, had been heavy enough to adhere to the fabric for hours, had also been volatile enough to have disappeared completely, leaving a residue which was identified as a magnesium isotope. Equally spectacular had been the disappearance of Mademoiselle Fredegond Valmy. A cable from the Slovakian ambassador had arrived a few hours later, denying her authenticity. And with her disappearance came the discovery that she had been at the head of an espionage system with ramifications in every State Department and in every statesman's home. 3 days passed with no sign from the enemy. The council sat all day. In the executive offices of the White House, Dick toiled ceaselessly, planning, receiving reports, organizing the flights of airplanes at strategic points throughout his district. From time to time he would be summoned to the council. At night he threw himself upon a cot in his office and slept a sleep broken by the constant arrival of messengers. And still there was no clue to the location of the headquarters of the marauders. But in those 3 days there had been no sign of them. Hope had succeeded despair. In the rebound of confidence, the populace was beginning to ridicule the nationwide precautions against what were coming to be considered merely a gang of super-criminals. It was even whispered that President Hargreaves had not been kidnapped at all. The Free Men's Party accused the government of a plot to subvert popular liberties. Dick received a summons on the third evening. Utterly worn out with his work, he pulled himself together and made his way into the Blue Room, where the council was assembled. Vice President Tomlinson, an elderly man, was in the chair. A nonentity, pushed into a post that it had been thought he would adorn innocuously, good golly, and he had been overwhelmed by a succession to the chief office of state. Tomlinson did not like Dick, or any of the hustling younger officers who, unlike himself, realized the real significance of the danger that overhung the country. He sat pompously in his leather chair, regarding Dick as he entered in obedience to the summons.
Well, Captain Rennell, what have you to report to us this evening? He inquired, as Dick saluted and stood to attention at the table.
We're improving our concentrations, Mr. Vice President. We've 8 flights of seaplanes scouring the coast in the hopes of locating the stronghold of the Invisible Emperor. We've...
I'm sick and tired of that title, shouted Tomlinson.
He sprang to his feet, his face flushed with anger. His nerves had broken under the continuous strain.
I'll give you my opinion, Captain Rennell, he said, and that is that this so-called Invisible Emperor is a myth. A gang of thieves has invented a paint that renders them inconspicuous, has created a panic, and is taking advantage of it to terrorize the country. The whole business is poppycock, in my opinion, and the sooner this bubble bursts, the better. Well, sir, what have you to say to that?
Have you ever seen any of these men in their invisible clothing, if I may ask, Mr. Vice President? Inquired Dick, trying to keep down his anger. His nerves, too, were badly frazzled.
No, sir, I have not. But my opinion is that this story is grossly exaggerated, and that the persons responsible are the reporters of our sensational press, thundered Tomlinson. Come on up, cat. Come on. No, you don't wanna.
One sec, folks. My cat is being a sweetie. He wants some loving. I can tell.
Come on up. No,
There you go.
come on. Yeah, yeah. There we go. Toasty cat.
He looked about him, a weak man, proud of having asserted his authority. Somebody laughed. Tomlinson glared at Dick, his rubicund visage purpling. But it was not Dick who had laughed, nor anyone at the council table. The laugh had come from the wall beside the door. Again it broke forth, high-pitched, cold, derisive. All heads turned as if upon pivots to see who had uttered it. "Good God!" exclaimed Secretary Norris of the War Department, and slumped in his chair. 5 feet 8 inches from the floor a pair of gray eyes looked at the council members out of emptiness. Gray eyes, a man's eyes, cool, contemptuous, and filled with authority, with a contemptuous sense of superiority that left every man there dumb. Dick was the first to recover himself. He stepped forward, not to where the invisible man was standing, but to a point between him and the door. That cold laugh broke forth again.
Gentlemen, I am an ambassador from my sovereign, who chooses to be known as the Invisible Emperor, came the words. As such, I claim immunity. Not that I greatly care, should you wish to violate the laws of nations and put me to death. But believe me, in such case the retribution will be a terrible one.
Suddenly the envoy peeled off the gas-impregnated garments that covered him. He stood before the council, a fair-haired young man, clad in the same fashion of trim black uniform as the bayoneted soldier had worn upstairs 3 nights before. He bowed disdainfully, and it was Tomlinson who shouted,
Arrest that man! I know his face. I've seen it in the papers.
He's Von Kettler, the murderer who escaped from jail in an invisible suit. Oh, come, Mr. Vice President, laughed Von Kettler. Are you sure this isn't all very much exaggerated?
Tomlinson sank back in his chair, his ruddy face covered with sweat. Dick stared at Von Kettler. A suspicion was forming in his mind. He had seen eyes like those before, dark instead of gray, and yet with the same look of pride and breeding in them. The look of the face, too, impossible to mistake. He knew. Fredegond Valmy was Von Kettler's sister.
Well, gentlemen, am I to receive the courtesies of an ambassador?
Inquired Van Kettler, advancing.
You shall have the privileges of the gallows rope, shouted Tomlinson. Arrest that man at once, Captain Rennell.
Pardon me, Mr. Vice President, suggested the Secretary for the Navy blandly, but perhaps it would be more desirable to hear what he has to say.
Immunity for thieves, robbers, murderers. Might I suggest, said Von Kettler suavely, that, since the United States has honored my master by placing itself upon a war footing, it has accorded him the rights of a belligerent?
We'll hear you, Mr. Von Kettler, said the Secretary of State, glancing along the table. 3 or 4 nodded, and 2 shook their heads.
Tomlinson only glared speechlessly at the intruder. Von Kettler advanced to the table and laid a paper upon it. "You recognize that signature, gentlemen?" At the bottom of the paper Dick saw scrawled the bold and unmistakable signature of President Hargreaves. "An order signed by the President of your country," purred Von Kettler, "ordering your military forces replaced upon a peace footing and the acceptance of our conditions. They are not onerous and will not interfere with the daily life of the country. Merely a little change in that outworn document, the Constitution. My master rules America henceforward." Somebody laughed. Another laughed. But it was the Secretary of State who did the fine thing. He took up the paper bearing what purported to be President Hargreaves' signature and tore it in two.
"The people of this country are her rulers," he said, "not an old man dragooned into signing a proclamation while in captivity, if, indeed, that is President Hargreaves' signature."
There came a sudden burst of applause. Von Kettler's face became the mask of a savage beast. He shook his fist furiously. "You call my master a forger?" he shouted. "You yourselves repudiate your own constitution, which places the control of army and navy in the hands of your president. You refuse to honor his signature?"
"Listen to me, Mr. Von Kettler."
The voice of the Secretary of State cut like a steel edge.
"You totally mistake the temper of the people of this country. We don't surrender, even to worthy adversaries, much less to a gang of common thieves, murderers, and criminals like yourselves. You have been accorded the privilege you sought, that of an envoy, and that was straining the point. Show yourself here again after 2 minutes have elapsed, and you'll go to the gallows for keeps."
"Dogs!" shouted Von Kettler, beside himself with fury. "Your doom is upon you even at this moment. I have but to wave my arm, and Washington shall be destroyed, and with her a score of other cities. I tell you, you are at our mercy. Thousands of lives shall pay for this insult to my master. I warn you, such a catastrophe is coming as shall show you the Invisible Emperor does not threaten in vain." With complete nonchalance, the Secretary of State took out his watch.
1 minute and 15 seconds remaining. Captain Rennell, he said, at the expiration of that time, put Mr. Von Kettler under arrest. I advise you to go back to your master quickly, Mr. Von Kettler," he added, "and tell him that we'll have no dealings with him, now or ever."
For a moment longer Von Kettler stood, glaring. Then, with a laugh of derision and a gesture of the hands, he vanished from view. And, though they might have expected that denouement, the members of the council leaped to their feet, staring incredulously at the place where he had been. Nothing of Von Kettler was visible, not even the eyes, and there sounded not the slightest footfall. Dick sprang forward to the door, but his outstretched arms encountered only emptiness. In spite of the Secretary of State's instructions, he was almost minded to apprehend the man, if he could get him. The corridor was empty. A guard of soldiers was at the entrance, but they did not block the entrance. Even now Von Kettler might be passing them. Why didn't his feet sound upon the floor? How could a bulky man glide so smoothly? Perhaps because Dick was undecided what to do, Von Kettler escaped him. By the time he reached the guards, he knew he had escaped. Suddenly there came an unexpected denouement. Somewhere on the White House lawn a guard challenged, fired. The snap of one of the silenced automatics answered him. When Dick and the guards reached the spot, the man was lying in a crumpled heap.
"An airplane!"
he gasped. "Invisible airplane! I bumped into it. Men in it. The damned dogs!" He died. Dick stared around him. There was no sign of any airplane on the lawn, nothing but the tents of the guards, white in the moonlight, and the grim array of anti-aircraft guns that Dick had placed there. But behind the White House, in hastily constructed hangars, were a half dozen of the latest pursuit airships, beautiful slim hulls, heavily armored, with armored turrets containing each a quick firer with the new armor-piercing bullets. One of these ships, Dick's own, was kept perpetually warmed and ready to take to the air. Dick raced across the lawn, yelled to the startled guard in charge. The mechanics came running from their quarters. Almost by the time Dick reached it, the ship was ready. He twirled the helicopter starter, and she roared and zoomed, taking an angle of 125 degrees upward off a runway of 20 yards. Into the air she soared, into the moonlight, up like an arrow for 500 feet. Dick pulled the soaring lever, and she hung there, buzzing like a bee as her helicopters, counteracting the pull of gravity, held her comparatively stable. He scanned the air all about him. Washington lay below, her myriad lights gleaming. Immediately beneath him, Dick saw the guns and the tents of the soldiers, and the little group that was removing the body of the murdered soldier on a stretcher. But there were no signs of any hostile craft. Had the murdered man really bumped into an invisible airship, or had he only thought he had? Had those devils learned to apply the gas to the surfaces of airplanes? There was no reason why they should not have done so. But surely the utmost ingenuity of man had not contrived to render a modern plane, with its metalwork and machinery, absolutely transparent. And again, how was it possible to have silenced the sound of engines, the whir of a propeller, so that there should be no auditory indication whatever of a plane's presence? Dick looked all about him. Nothing was in the air. He could have sworn it. He replaced the soaring lever and banked in a close circle, his glance piercing the night. No, there was nothing. Crash! Boom! The plane rocked violently, tossing upon gusts of air. A huge, gaping hole of blackness had suddenly appeared in the middle of the White House lawn. The tents were flat upon the ground. Through the rising smoke clouds, Dick saw tongues of flame. No shell that, but a bomb, dropped from the skies less than 500 feet from where Dick hovered. Yet there was nothing visible in the skies save the round orb of the moon. A rush of wind passed Dick's face. One of the vanes of the helicopter crumpled and fluttered away into the night. Dick needed no further persuasion. The dead soldier had not lied. Von Kettler had begun the fulfillment of his threat. Chapter 5. The Enemy Strikes. As Dick's airship veered and side-slipped, he kicked hard on the left rudder and brought the nose around. Furiously, he sprayed the air with a leaden hail from his quick-firer. He heard a rush of wind go past him, and realized that his unseen antagonist had all but rammed him. Yet nothing was visible at all, save the moon and the empty sky. He had heard the rush of the prop wash, but he had seen nothing, heard nothing else. Incredible as it seemed, the pilot was flying a plane that had attained not merely invisibility, but complete absence of all sound. Dick side-slipped down, pancaked, and crashed. He emerged from a plane wrecked beyond hope of early repair, yet luckily with no injury beyond a few minor bruises. He rushed toward the hangar to encounter a bevy of scared mechanics. "Another plane! Rev one up, quick!" he shouted. Planes were being wheeled out. Pilots in flying suits and goggles were striding beside them. Dick ordered one of them away, stepped into his plane, and in a moment was in the air again. In the minute or two that had elapsed since the encounter, the enemy had been active. Crash after crash was resounding from various parts of Washington. Buildings were rocking and toppling, debris strewed in the streets. Fires were springing up everywhere. 1,000 feet aloft, Dick could see the holocaust of destruction that was being wrought by the infernal missiles. Bombs of such power had been the unattained ambition of every government of the world, and it had been left to the men of the Invisible Emperor to attain them. Whole streets went into ruin at each discharge, and from everywhere within the city the wailing cry of the injured went up in a resonant moan of pain. In the central part of the city, the district about F Street and the government buildings, nothing was standing, except those buildings fashioned of structural steel, and these showed twisted girders like the skeletons of primeval monsters, supporting sections of sagging floors. Houses, hotels had melted into shapeless heaps of rubble, which filled the streets to a depth of a dozen yards, burying everything beneath them. Yet here and there could be seen the forms of dead pedestrians, motor cars emerging out of the debris, lying in every conceivable position. Horses, horribly mangled, were shrieking as they tried to free themselves. And yet, despite this ruin, the general impression upon Dick's mind, as he beat to and fro, signaling to his flight to spread, was that of a vast, empty desolation. Further away, where the ruin had not yet fallen, thousands of human beings were milling in a mess, those upon the fringes of the crowd perpetually breaking away, other swarms approaching them, so that the entire agglomeration resembled a seething whirlpool turning slowly upon itself. Then, of a sudden, the strains of the national anthem floated up to Dick's ears. A band was playing in the White House grounds. The tune was ragged, and the drum came in a fraction of a second late, but an immense pride and elation filled Dick's soul. "They'll never beat us," he thought, "with such a spirit as that." He had signaled his flight to spread and search the air. He could see the individual ships darting here and there over the immensity of the city, but none knew better than he how fruitless their effort was, and the marauders had not ceased their deadly work. A bomb dropped near the Washington Monument, sending up a huge spout of dust that veiled it from his eyes. Instinctively, Dick shot toward the scene. Slowly, the dust subsided, and then a yell of exultation broke from Dick's lips. The noble shaft still stood, a slim taper pointing to the skies. It was an omen of ultimate success, and Dick took heart. No, they'd never beat the grim, unconquerable tenacity of the American people. Yet the damage was proceeding at a frightful rate. A bomb dropped squarely on the Corcoran Gallery and oh my God, I can't talk today. A bomb dropped squarely on the Corcoran Gallery and resolved it into a heap of silly stones. A bomb fell in the middle of Pennsylvania Avenue, and the houses on either side collapsed like houses of cards, falling into a sulphurous, fiery pit. And still there was nothing visible but the sky and the moon. Dick gritted his teeth and swore as he circled over the site of destruction, out of which tiny figures were struggling. He heard the clang of the fire bells as the motor trucks came roaring toward the scene. Then crash again. 5 blocks northward, another dense cloud of dust arose, and the new area of destruction, spreading as swiftly as ripples over a pond, joined the former one, leaving a huge, irregular open space, piled up with masonry and brick in a number of flat-topped pyramids. Into this, houses went crashing every moment, with a sound like the clatter of falling crockery, but infinitely magnified. "The devils! The swine!" shouted Dick. "And we gave Von Kettler the privileges of an ambassador!" And Fredegond was the sister of this devil. The remembrance of that struck a cold chill to Dick's heart again. He tried to blot out her picture from his mind, but he still saw her as she had appeared that day after the air ride, flushed, smiling, radiant in her dark beauty. A murderess and a spy. He cursed her as he banked and circled back. He was helpless. He could do nothing, and all Washington would be destroyed by morning if the supply of bombs kept up. But there was more to come. Suddenly, Dick became aware that two of his flight, at widely separated distances, were going down in flames. Flaming comets, they dropped plump into the destruction below. Another caught fire and was going down. No need to question what was happening. The invisible enemy was attacking his flight and picking off his men one by one. He drove furiously toward two of his planes whose erratic movements showed that they were being attacked. As he neared them, he saw one catch fire and begin its earthward swoop. Then the fuselage crackled beside him, and his instrument board dissolved into ruin. Instinctively, he went round in a tight bank and loosed his machine gun. Nothing there. Nothing at all. Yet his right wing went ragged, and his own furious blasts into the sky, their echoes drowned by the roar of his propeller, were productive of nothing. He shot past the uninjured plane, signaling it to descend. He wasn't going to let his men ride aloft to helpless butchery. Nothing could be done until some means was discovered of counteracting the enemy's terrific advantage. He darted across the heart of the city to where another of the flight was circling, waggling his wings to indicate it to descend. Then on to the next plane, and the next, shepherding them. Thank God they understood. They were bunching toward the hangar. Yet another took fire and dropped, a burning wreck. Half his flight out of commission, and not an enemy visible. He was aloft now, alone, courting death. Instant, invisible death. He wouldn't descend until that carnival of murder was at an end. But it was not at an end. Another crash, far up Pennsylvania Avenue, showed an attempt upon the Capitol again. Again, and a smoking hell wreathed the noble buildings, so that it was no longer possible to see them. A lull, and then a crash nearer the city's heart. Crash! Crash! Invisible though the enemy was, it was easy to trace the movements of this particular plane by the successive areas of destruction that it left behind. It was coming back over Pennsylvania Avenue, dropping its bombs at intervals. It was methodically wiping out an entire section of Washington. Dick drove his plane toward it. There was one chance in 1,000 that, if he could accurately gauge the progress of his invisible antagonist, he could crash him and go down with him to death. If he could get close enough to feel his prop wash. A wild chance, but Dick's mind was keyed up to desperation. He shot like an arrow toward the scene, with a view to intercepting the murderer. Then of a sudden he became aware of a curious phenomenon. A black beam was shooting across the sky. A black searchlight. It came from the flat top of a large hotel that had somehow escaped the universal destruction, and, with its gaunt skeleton of structural steel showing in squares, towered out of the ruin all about it like an island. It was from here that the black beam started. It spread fanwise across the sky. But it was not merely blackness. It was utter and impenetrable darkness, cleaving the sky like a knife. Where it passed, the rays of the moon were extinguished as fire is extinguished by water. A beam of absolute blackness that pierced the air like a widening cone, and made the night seem, by contrast, of dazzling brightness along either dark border. High into the air that dark beam shot, moving to and fro in the sky. Dick, darting toward the spot where he hoped to find his invisible enemy, found himself caught in it. In utter, inextinguishable darkness. Like a trapped bird he fluttered, hurling himself this way and that, till suddenly he found himself blinking in the dazzling light of the moon again, and the black beam was overhead. Crash! Another widening sphere of ruin as the invisible marauder dropped a bomb. Dick cursed bitterly. Trapped in that black beam, he had lost his direction. The invisible plane had shot past the point where he had hoped to intercept it. He flung his soaring lever and hung suspended in the air, an easy mark for the enemy if he chose to take the opportunity. No matter. Death was all that Dick craved. He had seen half his flight wiped out, and 100,000 human beings hurled to destruction. He wanted to die. Then suddenly a wild shout came to his ears, as if all Washington had gone mad with triumph. And Dick heard himself shouting too, before he knew it, almost before he knew why. For overhead, where the inky finger searched the sky, a luminous shape appeared, a silvery cigar riding in the void. The finger missed it, and again there was only the moonlight. It caught him again, and again the whole devastated city rang with yells of derision, hate, and anger as the black beam held it. It held it. To and fro that silvery cigar scurried in a frantic attempt to avoid detection, and remorselessly the black beam held it down. It held it down, and it outlined it as clearly as a figure on the moving picture screen. Then suddenly there came a flash, followed by a dull detonation, and a black cloud appeared, spreading into a flower of death near the cigar, and at the edge of the black beam. The cheers grew frantic. The anti-aircraft battery in the White House grounds had grasped the situation and was opening fire. To and fro like a trapped beast the cigar-shaped airplane fled. Once it seemed to escape. It faded from the edge of the black finger, faded into nothingness amid a roar of execretion. Whoops. Then it was caught and held. Truncated, bounded by an arc of the sky, the black finger followed the murderer in his flight remorselessly, and all around him the anti-aircraft guns were placing a barrage of death. He was trapped. No need for Dick to rush into battle. To do so might call off that deadly barrage that held the murderer in a ring of death. Hovering, Dick watched, and then, perhaps panic-stricken, perhaps rendered desperate, perhaps through sheer wanton courage that might have commanded admiration under nobler circumstances, the airship turned and drove straight in the direction of the battery, dropping another bomb as she did so. It fell in a crowded street, swarming with spectators who had clambered upon the falling debris, and it wrought hideous destruction. But this time there was hardly a cry, no unison of despair such as had come to Dick's ears before. The suspense was too tense. All eyes watched the airship as, seeming to bear a charmed life, she drove for the White House itself, through a ring of shells that widened and contracted alternately, with the object of placing a last bomb squarely upon the building before going down in death. And all the while the black searchlight held it. Dick Rennell was to experience many thrilling moments afterward, but there was never a period, measurable by seconds yet seeming to extend through all eternity, never a period quite so fraught with suspense as, hovering there, he watched the flight of that silvery plane speeding straight toward the executive mansion, while all around it the shells bloomed and spread. It was over the White House grounds. The Archies had failed. They were being outmaneuvered. They could not be swung in time to follow the trajectory of the plane. Dick held his breath. Then, suddenly, the silvery ship dissolved in a blaze of fire, a shower of golden sparks such as fly from a rocket, and simultaneously the last bomb that she was to drop broke upon the ground below. Down she plunged, instantly invisible as she escaped the finger of the black beam, but she dropped into the vortex of ruin that she herself had created, into a pit of blazing fire, crisscrossed by falling trees, that had engulfed the battery and a score of men. Then, suddenly, Dick understood. He flung home the soaring lever, banked and headed, not for the White House, but for the flat roof of the hotel from which the black searchlight was still projecting itself through the skies. He hovered above and dropped, light as a feather, upon the rooftop. There was only one person there,
An old man, dressed in a shabby suit, kneeling before a great block of stone that had been dislodged upward from the parapet and formed a sort of table. Upon this table the old man had placed a large, square box, resembling an exaggerated kodak, and it was from the lens of this box that the black beam was projecting. Dick sprang from his cockpit as the old man rose in alarm. He ran to him and caught him by the arm. "Luke Evans!" he cried. "Thank God you've come back in time to save America!" Chapter 6. The Gas. In the blue room of the White House, the council listened to old Luke Evans's exposition of his invention with feelings ranging from incredulity to hope.
"I've been at work all the time," said the old man, "not far from here. I knew the day would come when you'd need me. I put my pride aside for the sake of my country."
"Tell us in a few words about this discovery of yours, Mr. Evans," said Colonel Stopford. Luke Evans placed the square black case upon the table.
"It's simple, like all big things, sir," he answered. "The original shadow-breaking device that I invented was a heavy, inert gas, invisible, but almost as viscous as paint. Applied to textiles, to inorganic matter, to animal bodies, it adheres for hours. Its property is to render such substances invisible by absorbing all the visible light rays that fall upon it, from red to violet. Light passes through all substances that are coated with this paint as if they did not exist."
"And this antidote of yours?" asked Colonel Stopford.
"Darkness," replied Luke Evans. "A beam of darkness means absolute invisibility. It can be shot from this apparatus." He indicated the box upon the table. "This box contains a minute portion of a gas which exists in nature in the form of a black crystalline powder. The peculiar property of this powder is that it is the solidified form of a gas more volatile than any that is known. So volatile is it that, when the ordinary atmospheric pressure of 15 pounds to the square inch is removed, the powder instantly changes to the gaseous condition. By pressing this lever," Evans pointed at the box, "a vacuum is created. Instantly the powder becomes a gas, which shoots forth through this aperture with the speed of a projectile, taking the form of a beam of absolute blackness. Or it can be discharged from cylinders in such a way as to extend over a large area within a few minutes."
"But how does this darkness make the invisible airships luminous?" asked Stopford. "Why does not your darkness destroy all light?"
"In this way, sir," replied the old inventor. "The shadow-breaking gas with which the airships are painted confers invisibility because it absorbs sunlight, but it does not absorb the still more rapid waves, or oscillations, which manifest themselves as radioactivity. On the contrary, it gathers and reflects these. Now, Rontgen, the discoverer of the X-ray, observed that if X-rays are allowed to enter the eye of an observer who is in complete darkness, the retina receives a stimulus, and light is perceived, due to the fluorescent action of the X-rays upon the eyeball."
Which I think is actually Cherenkov radiation, as a side note.
"Consequently, by creating a beam of complete darkness, I bring into clear visibility the fluorescent gas that coats the airships. In other words, the airships become visible."
"If a light ray is nullified upon entering the field of darkness, will it emerge at the other edge as a perfect light ray again?" asked Stopford.
"It will emerge unchanged, since the black beam destroys light by slightly slowing down the vibrations to a point where they are not perceived as light by the human eye. On emerging from the beam, however, these vibrations immediately resume their natural frequency. To give you a homely parallel, the telephone changes sound waves to electric waves and reconverts them into sound waves at the other end without any appreciable interruption.
Then, said Stopford, the logical application of your method is to plunge every city in the land into darkness by means of this gas?
That is so, sir, and then we shall have the advantage of invisibility, and the enemy ships will be in fluorescence.
Damned impracticable, muttered Stopford. You seriously propose to darken the greater parts of eastern North America? Asked the Secretary for War.
The gas can be produced in large quantities from coal tar besides existing in crystalline deposits, replied Luke Evans. It is so volatile that I estimate that a single ton will darken all eastern North America for 5 days, whereas the concentration would be made only in specific areas liable to attack. The gas is distilled with great facility from one of the triphenylcarbinol coal tar derivatives.
Vice President Tomlinson was a pompous, irascible old man, but it was he who hit the nail on the head.
That's all very well for as an emergency measure, but we've got to find the haunt of that gang and smash it.
An orderly brought in a telegraphic dispatch and handed it to him. The vice president opened it, glanced through it, and tried to hand it to the Secretary of State. Instead, it fluttered from his nerveless fingers, and he sank back with a groan. The secretary picked it up and glanced at it. "Gentlemen," he said, trying to control his voice, "New York was bombed out of the blue at sunrise this morning, and the whole lower part of the city is a heap of ruins." In the days that followed, it became clear that all the resources of America would be needed to cope with the Invisible Empire. Not a day passed without some blow being struck. Boston, Charleston, Baltimore, Pittsburgh, in turn, were devastated. 3 cruisers and a score of minor craft were sunk in the harbor of Newport News, where they were concentrating, and thenceforward the fleet became a fugitive force, seeking concealment rather than an offensive. Transatlantic sea traffic ceased. Meanwhile, the black gas was being hurriedly manufactured. From cylinders placed in central positions in a score of cities, it was discharged continuously, covering these centers with an impenetrable pall of night that no light would penetrate. Only by the glow of radium paint, which commanded fabulous prices, could official business be transacted, and that only to a very small degree. Courts were closed, businesses suspended, prisoners released, perforce, from jails. Famine ruled. The remedy was proving worse than the disease. Within a week the use of the dark gas had to be discontinued, and a temporary suspension of the raids served only to accentuate the general terror. There were food riots everywhere, demands that the government come to terms, and counter-demands that the war be fought out to the bitter end. Fought out when everything was disorganized? Stocks of food congested all the terminals, mobs rioted and battled and plundered all through the East. "It means surrender," was voiced at the council meeting by one of the members, and nobody answered him. 3 days of respite, then, instead of bombs, proclamations fluttering down from a cloudless sky. Unless the white flag of surrender was hoisted from the summit of the battered capital, the invisible emperor would strike such a blow as should bring America to her knees. It was a 12-hour ultimatum. Before 3 hours had passed, thousands of citizens had taken possession of the capital and filled all the approaches. Over their heads floated banners, the stars and stripes, and, blazoned across them, the words, "No surrender." It was a spontaneous uprising of the people of Washington, hungry, homeless in the sharpening autumn weather, and nearly all bereft of members of their families, too often of the breadwinner. Now lying deep beneath the rubble that littered the streets, they had gathered in their thousands to protest against any attempt to yield. Dick, flying overhead at the apex of his squadron, felt his heart swell with elation as he watched the orderly crowds. This was at 3 in the afternoon. At 6 the ultimatum ended. The new frightfulness was to begin.
At 5, Vice President Tomlinson was to address the crowds. The old man had risen to the occasion. He had cast off his pompousness and vanity, and was known to favor war to the bitter end. Dick and his squadron circled above the broken dome as the car that carried the Vice President and the Secretaries of State and for War approached along the avenue.
Rat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat.
Out of the blue sky streams of lead were poured into the assembled multitudes. Instantly they had become converted into a panic-stricken mob, turning this way and that.
Rat-a-tat-tat.
Swaths of dead and dying men rolled in the dust, and, as wheat falls under the reaper's blade, the mob melted away in lines and by battalions. Within 30 seconds, the whole terrain was piled with dead and dying. "My God, it's a massacre! It's murder!" shouted Dick. They had not even waited for the 12 hours to expire. To and fro the invisible airplanes shot through the blue evening sky, till the last fugitives were streaming away in all directions like hunted deer, and the dead lay piled in ghastly heaps everywhere. Out of these heaps wounded and dying men would stagger to their feet to shake their fists impotently at their murderers. In vain Dick and his squadron strove to dash themselves into the invisible airships. The pilots eluded them with ease, sometimes sending a contemptuous round of machine gun bullets in their direction, but not troubling to shoot them down. Two small boys, carrying a huge banner with "No Surrender" across it, were walking off the ghastly field. 12 or 14 years old at most, they disdained to run. They were singing the national anthem, though their voices were inaudible through the turmoil.
Rat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat-tat.
The fiends above loosed a storm of lead upon them. Both fell. One rose, still clutching the banner in his hand, and waved it aloft. In a sudden silence his childish treble could be heard. "My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty." The guns rattled again. Clutching the blood-stained banner, he dropped across the body of his companion. Suddenly a broad band of black soared upward from the earth. Those in charge of the cylinders placed about the Capitol had released the gas. A band of darkness rising into the blue, cutting off the earth, making the summit of the ruined Capitol a floating dome. But, fast as it rose, the invisible airships rose faster above it. A last vicious volley. Two of Dick's flight crashing down upon the piles of dead men underneath, and nothing was visible, although the darkness rose till it obliterated the blue above. At dawn the council sat, after an all-night meeting. Vice President Tomlinson, one arm shattered by a machine gun bullet, still occupied the chair at the head of the table. Outside, immediately about the White House, there was not a sound. Washington might have been a city of the dead. The railroad terminals, however, were occupied by a mob of people busily looting. There was great disorder. Organized government had simply disappeared. Each man was occupied only with obtaining as much food as he could carry, and taking his family into rural districts where the Terror would not be likely to pursue. All the roads leading out of Washington, into Virginia, into Maryland, were congested with columns of fugitives that stretched for miles. Some, who were fortunate enough to possess automobiles and, what was rarer, a few gallons of gas, were trying to force their way through the masses ahead of them. Here and there a family trudged beside a pack horse, or a big dog drew an improvised sled on wheels, loaded with flour, bacon, blankets, pillows. Old men and young children trudged on, uncomplaining. The telegraph wires were still, for the most part, working. All the world knew what was happening. From all the big cities,
Yes, cat, yes, yes. Meow.
from all the big cities of the East, a similar exodus was proceeding. There was little bitterness and little disorder. It was not the airship raids from which these crowds were fleeing. Something grimmer was happening. The murderous attack upon the populace about the capital had been merely come on, cat. Had been merely an incident. Come on, cat. This later development was the fulfillment of the Invisible Emperor's ultimatum. Let's try that again with a cat now settled down so he's not being as much of a pest. Love you too, Mr. Cat. It was not the airship raids from which these crowds were fleeing. Something grimmer was happening. The murderous attack upon the populace about the capital had been merely an incident. This later development was the fulfillment of the Invisible Emperor's ultimatum. Death was afield. Death. Invisible, instantaneous, and inevitable. Death blown on the winds in the form of the deadliest of unknown gases. In the blue room of the White House a score of experts had gathered. Dick, too, with the chiefs of staff, Stopford, and the army and naval heads. Among them was the chief of the Meteorological Bureau, and it was to him primarily that Tomlinson was reading a telegraphic dispatch from Wilmington, South Carolina. The invisible death has reached this point and is working havoc throughout the city, spreading from street to street. Men are dropping dead everywhere. A few have fled, but the sudden ending of the dispatch was significant enough. Tomlinson picked up another dispatch from Columbia, in the same state. Invisible death now encircling city, he read. Business section already invaded. All other telegraphists have left posts. Can't say how long. And this, too, ended in the same way. There were piles of such communications, and they had been coming in for 18 hours. At the moment, an orderly brought in a dozen more. Tomlinson showed the head of the Meteorological Bureau the chart upon the table. "We've plotted out a map as the wires came in, Mr. Graves," he said. "The invisible death struck the southeast shore of the United States yesterday afternoon near Charleston. It has spread approximately at a steady rate. The wind velocity remains constant, 70 miles an hour, dying down a little," answered Graves. "The death line now runs from Wilmington, South Carolina, straight to Augusta, Georgia," the vice president pursued. "Every living thing that this gas has encountered has been instantly destroyed. Men, cattle, birds, vermin, wild beasts. The gas is invisible and inodorous. These gentlemen believe it may be a form of hydrocyanic acid, but of a concentration beyond anything known to chemistry, so deadly that a billionth part of it to one of air must be fatal. Otherwise it could not have traveled as it has done. Warnings have been broadcasted, but there are no stocks of chemicals that might counteract it. Flight is the only hope. Flight at 70 miles an hour." His voice shook. "This gas has been loosed, as you told us, upon the wings of the hurricane that came through the Florida Strait. What are the chances of it reaching Washington?" "Mr. Vice President, if the wind continues and this gas has sufficient concentration, it should be in Washington within the next 8 hours," Graves replied. "If the wind changes direction, however, this gas will probably be blown out to sea, or into the Alleghanies, where it will probably be dissipated among the hills, or by the foliage on the mountains. I'm not a chemist." "No, sir, and I am not consulting you as one," answered old Tomlinson. "A death belt several hundred miles in length and 300 or 400 deep has already been cut across this continent. We are faced with wholesale, unmitigated murder on a scale as was never known before. But we are an integral part of America, and Washington has no more right to expect immunity than our devastated southern states. The question we wish to put to you is, can you trace the exact course taken by the hurricane?" "I can, Mr. Vice President," answered Graves. "It originated somewhere in the West Indian seas, like all these storms. We've been getting our reports almost as usual. Our first one came from Nassau, which was badly damaged. The storm missed the Florida coast, as many of them do, and struck the coast of South Carolina. In fact, we received a report from Charleston, which must have almost coincided with your first report of the gas." "If the storm missed the Florida coast, it follows that the gas was not discharged from any point on the American continent," said Tomlinson. "From some point off Florida,
From some island, or from a plane, or from a ship at sea.
Not
Not from a ship at sea, Mr. Vice President, interposed the head of the Chemical Bureau. To discharge gas on such an extensive scale would require more space than could be furnished by the largest vessel, in my opinion.
In all probability, the gas was loaded, so to say, onto the Gale somewhere in the Bahamas, said Graves. That seems to me the most likely explanation. Vice President Tomlinson nodded and picked up one of the latest telegraphic dispatches, as if absently.
Gentlemen, he said, the Invisible Death has already reached Charlotte.
He picked up another.
Reported Abaco Island, Bahamas, totally wrecked by storm. All communication has ceased, he read.
He turned to Dick and spoke as if inspired.
Captain Rennell, there is your destination, he thundered. They've betrayed themselves. We've got them now. You understand?
By God, sir, it's from Abaco Island, then, that those devils have been carrying on their game of wholesale murder. Suddenly, a contagion of enthusiasm seemed to sweep the whole assemblage. Every man was upon his feet in an instant. White, quivering lips opened for speech that trembled there and did not come. It was Secretary Norris who spoke.
The Vice President has hit the mark, he said, with a dramatic gesture of his arm. Yes, they've betrayed themselves. Their headquarters are on Abaco Island. It's one of the largest in the Bahamas.
He turned to the Secretary for the Navy.
You can rush the fleet there, sir? He asked. Within 48 hours, I'll have every vessel that can float off Abaco Island.
I'll concentrate all airplanes. Take your flight, Captain Rennell. We'll stamp out that nest of murderers if we blow Abaco Island to the bottom of the sea. It can be done.
It can be done, sir, with Luke Evans and his invention, answered Dick. And with that, I'm going to have to call it for today. Um, there's still a couple more chapters, which we will get to next week. Thanks for tuning in if you did tune in. Hope you enjoyed. I do this every week, every Saturday morning, um, at the same time, noon Eastern Standard. I also have two other streams I do throughout the week. A Mecha Mondays stream where I do something mecha or giant robot related, and a Warframe Wednesdays stream where I do a stream involving Warframe every Wednesday. Same time, same station. Thanks for tuning in and have a great week. Bye.